Hello, and welcome to my religion project. Today, we will be following Paul's third missionary journey, and we will be starting in the city of Antioch. Now, Antioch was founded in the 4th century BC on the Orontes River. It's a very important city for the Rome because this city is actually the seat of the Roman governor in the area. So, a very important city in Asia Minor and the Middle East of the Roman Empire. In 50 AD, Antioch is a very well-established city. Here's a marketplace, which is cool for like culture. Over here, I thought this would be interesting to add. There was a shrine to the goddess Artemis, or the Roman equivalent of the Greek goddess Artemis. And I thought this would be cool to include just because it could be a place where Paul could have maybe preached just to make like a statement. And I thought this would be pretty cool. Now, Antioch is a very diverse city. It's actually called the cradle of Christianity. And that's because it's very diverse because there were multiple communities living. There were, of course, aristocratic Romans, as this is the seat for the Roman governor of the Eastern Mediterranean. There's also very powerful Jewish communities. And this would actually lead to Paul being pushed out of the city. Threats from these powerful Pharisees, actually, would eventually lead to his, not really an exile, but they threatened his life and they threatened to arrest him. And this is what made him leave and start his third missionary journey around the Mediterranean. Here is a kind of like a harbor area on the river, just to show that this was a very economic city. Here's like a storehouse. In here are some Centurion guards. And I thought these would be cool to add, but more on them later, actually. And that concludes our time in Antioch. So here we are outside of Antioch, and we'll be departing from the city. Now, interestingly, outside of Roman cities, or large Roman cities, like Antioch, they would actually crucify people. And this is because anyone entering the city would see this, and it would kind of be like a show of power by the Roman government. Now, this wasn't the case for Jesus, and I'm not actually sure why, but maybe because Jerusalem wasn't as important of a city as Antioch was for the government, or maybe there wasn't a lot of criminals that day. I'm not really sure, but I just thought this was interesting to include. So here we are traveling along the Roman roads. Many of the architectural feats of ancient Rome are still around today, but none are more greatly preserved than the system of roads that connected the vast empire. The roads closest to Rome, the capital and most important city in the empire, were made of cobblestone and still exist today in great condition. The first and most famous is called Appian Way, built in 312 BC. It is 169 kilometers long. The road we're actually traveling on now, for most of the third journey, is called Via Asiana, which means Asian road. The main purpose of these roads is so that armies could travel throughout the empire quickly, which proved very useful during the Gallic Wars. However, the further you got away from Rome, the less these roadways would have been developed, which explains the state that this roadway's in. Now, just over this hill, we'll be entering the community of Lystra. And Lystra's kind of a weird city because it's not very big, and it's primarily a Gentile community, at least in the outer city where we are right now. There's no synagogue in this town, and most of the buildings here would probably have been kind of like huts. Not very rich people lived here. There's a pig. So this is a good place to plant a Christian community, and that's why Paul's visiting here in his third journey. Now, in the inner city, right here, this is kind of like a forum, and all Roman cities had this. Any governmental affairs that would have happened here would have happened in this building right here. So, this town's mostly Roman, and Paul's only here, I said before, checking on congregations he planted. And you might recognize this scene in particular as Raphael's painting, The Sacrifice at Lystra. And how that story goes is basically Paul and Barnabas were preaching here, and the pagans in the city thought that they were incarnations of the Greek gods Jupiter and Mercury, and started to sacrifice and kind of praise them. And Paul and Barnabas really didn't like this, but I based this scene right here heavily off of that painting because there's really nothing left of Lystra, and I thought that was pretty cool. So, who actually was Paul? Who was the man behind the missionary journey? Well, Paul was born to a very devout Jewish family, and later in his life he became a part of the Jewish movement, the religious movement of the Pharisees. Paul originally was named Saul and was against the church, and he persecuted Christians. However, and sources vary on this, but with an encounter with either an angel, the Holy Spirit, or maybe even Jesus himself, he decided to commit his life to evangelization. Paul's profession, coincidentally, was tent making, and he would use this, along with his reputation as a devout Jew and his Roman citizenship, to his advantage when traveling on these journeys. So, just across this bay, we arrive at Miletus. At one point, Miletus is a very wealthy city. However, it's declining under Roman rule. Now, Miletus, or rather the area it was built over, is ancient. This area was likely first settled in the Neolithic era around 3000 BC, so that predates the ancient Egyptians. It was conquered by, of course, the Macedonians, the Greeks. Pretty much everyone in the area, of course, wanted this city. Now, that includes the Romans. Miletus was actually entering a decline under Roman rule. Actually, most of the area was entering a decline under Roman rule. However, after Christianity came here, it would actually begin to flourish and become a metropolis. Now, the reason Paul is here on his third journey is because he's saying his final goodbyes to this group of interest called the Ephesian elders. Now, the Ephesians were a group, and he's basically teaching these guys how to become priests. And he's wishing them their goodbyes and good luck on their teachings. This is a reflecting pool. The Romans were big into these. And over here, these two, banners. Now, Rome didn't have a national flag. It had these two sigils. And these are pretty interesting, and you see them around a lot, so I thought I'd include them. I've cut ahead in Paul's journey for the sake of time. But right now, we'd be somewhere in southern Greece. After traveling from Miletus, Paul would travel to many other cities in Greece, Macedonia, and eventually loop back around, travel the Mediterranean to a town called Caesarea, which we'll get to soon. Now, during Paul's life, the Roman Empire was going through something called a Pax Romana, which is a name for a period of stability within the empire. It literally translates to Roman peace, which meant that the empire could spend less time expanding to oppress new peoples and focusing on oppressing the peoples in the lands it had already controlled. One of the good things that came out of Pax Romana was that the Roman Empire was a relatively safer place and essentially became a sort of police state. Now, I'm not saying that becoming a police state is necessarily a good or bad thing, but it definitely made travel through the empire easier. Now, we're about to enter a small port city on the coast of southern Judea. It's called Caesarea. Now, Caesarea was built by Herod the Great, who was known for building pretty marvelous cities, especially within the Judea area. He was a puppet leader instilled by Rome to try to keep peace in the area, although in my opinion he wasn't the best king. Now, Caesarea was a small port city, so it's not like it was very unique. However, it was home to one of Paul's very good friends, Philip, who's also an evangelist. Paul's staying at Philip's house to rest from this long journey, and after a couple days, a prophet named Agabus comes to visit him. And Agabus warns Paul that if he enters Jerusalem, which would be his next stop, that he would be arrested. However, Paul, because he's actually pretty awesome, travels to Jerusalem anyway. Now, what happens after this? Well, in Jerusalem, Paul is arrested and jailed for 2 years. After he gets out, he immediately starts his fourth missionary journey, which brings him straight to Rome, where he's arrested again and executed.